less than a year ago, safe to say Tsai Ing-wen didn't look at all like a sure thing to win re-election in Taiwan, and yet last Saturday she won what can only be described, I think, as a resounding victory, taking more than 57% of the vote to roughly 39% for her principal opponent. So what happened? We'll ask our guests that question, but also questions about the way forward. And while there may be many answers to the what happened question, the one that's getting the most attention here at least, or in the global press, the answer is Hong Kong happened. The protests there and the fact that Tsai Ing-wen made the protests such an essential part of her message and her campaign, as in, we in Taiwan stand with you in Hong Kong, we won't let that happen here, and so forth. You can only imagine how that message and then the results have gone down in Beijing itself. Joining us this morning to my right, Susan Thornton, Senior Fellow and Research Scholar at the Yale University Paul Tsai China Center. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, and until July of 2018, she served as Acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the State Department, and in that post was a lead voice on North Korea, the trade tensions with China, and many other things. She's got a long history of diplomatic work involving China and Korea, but also a career that has included time spent in Central Asia, Russia, as we were just discussing, and the Caucasus. And she is in that narrow segment of human beings who are fluent in English, Mandarin, and Russian. So I'm not sure we'll get to all three languages this morning, but welcome to you. And on my left, of course, Vincent Wei-chang Wang, who is Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Political Science at Adelphi University. He's been a Senior Fellow in the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Asia program since 2010, written extensively on all manner of policy issues affecting the Asia-Pacific, Taiwan, and mainland China in particular. And his most recent publications include A Taiwanese Perspective and the Taiwan Relations Act at 40, New Dynamics of an Enduring Framework. And I should note, Vincent is just back from Taipei, where he's been watching all this unfold. So thank you both so much for joining us. And we're going to jump right in here and really look at the results as seen from Beijing, Taipei, and Washington, and we may get to other points as well. And then, as always, we'll open up for your questions. So if we can start in Beijing, and maybe, Susan, start with you. I don't think I need to explain to people in this room, but just to get it out there, we know this much. China says and has always said Taiwan is its territory. It's been a no-go area for discussion, negotiation, and so forth. The state news agency Xinhua said the result was, quote, a fluke. And then this, another quote, this temporary countercurrent is just a bubble under the tide of the times. But of course, the fact that Tsai won and won so handily and won with that quite strong anti-Beijing message has to cause concern in Beijing. So can you speak a little bit about the reaction, Susan? And you said a moment ago that we might, as a result, have a greater chance of some mischief making, I think was your phrase, from Beijing.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, and it's great to be here with Vincent and with all of you. It's pretty early in the morning for this kind of panel, so my hat's off to all of you, and I hope you have coffee. I myself am not a morning person, but I'll try to keep up with the discussion. So I was traveling in Asia and in Beijing and Taiwan a little over a year ago at the time of the local elections in Taiwan, where the DPP got trounced. And that was the election, actually, in which Han Kuo-yu, the principal opponent of Tsai in this election, emerged in a surprise victory as the mayor of Kaohsiung, a city stronghold in the south that is typically not the provenance of KMT politicians. So the mood at that time, December last year, 2018, in Taiwan was extremely downbeat for the DPP folks that we talked to. And they pledged at that time to learn and to pull up their bootstraps and do a better job for the next go-round. Boy, what a difference a year makes. I was in Taiwan again this November in the run-up to these elections, and the sentiment couldn't have been more reversed. So in Beijing, both those times, talking about Taiwan, they were quite confident and almost gloating in the first trip. And then, by the time a year later we were there and the polls were showing Tsai running well ahead of Han at that point, they were much more tempered in their assessment. I mean, I can't agree with the fluke language of Xinhua. It's not surprising coming from them, I don't think. But the officials in Beijing were more in the mode of sort of the bubble under the tide. They were kind of expecting at that point, I think, Tsai to win. I mean, it looked very clear at that point. They were claimed to be confident that if Tsai won, there would be no way that she could take Taiwan to separation from the mainland. And they also said if Han wins, there's no way that he can pursue immediate unification, and that this is going to go on for a long time, and that the political and other differences are just too stark, and this is going to be a protracted process, but time is on our side. So that was the official gloss then. I think they're having a very hard time now defending publicly this result to their own people, and you see that in the mainland press. The story seems to be kind of convoluted, but I would say that, in the run-up to the election, I think China did take a lot of pains to remain kind of restrained. There were a lot of stories about mainland interference in the election. I think the result shows that whatever that was not successful, at least, and maybe it was less than was discussed in the press. But they did try to keep a low profile in the run-up to the election based on experiences they'd had in previous elections where they tried to weigh in heavily and obviously in favor of one candidate, and it backfired. So I think now that the results are in, I would point out that incumbents in Taiwan presidential elections have always come through. So it might not be as unexpected a result. It's a short history of elections in Taiwan, but still it seems that incumbency is quite powerful. So I think now that the result is in, the mainland will wait and watch and see what Tsai does. One of the things when we were in Beijing in November, they were watching very carefully is which way the LY would go, the legislature, and they thought that was quite close, and that it may be that there would be a KMT majority. That did not happen. DPP has a clear majority in the legislature, which will certainly push in the direction of more turbulence, I would say, as opposed to more of a deadlock situation, which might create conditions for some kind of more compromising stance. And I think that the thing that, people who watch Taiwan, and you saw this in the election speeches of the candidates that came right after the election results were announced, both of them and all of them actually made a plea for unity on the island. And I think that is something to watch going forward, because Beijing is pretty good at exploiting divisions, and that may be the place that they're going to be looking. I think we have a kind of a rocky picture ahead, actually.
And before I turn to Vincent, that mischief-making point, that's what you mean, I guess, by rocky road ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we've seen a lot of things happening in the past couple of years. Beijing's obviously very unhappy with Tsai's cross-strait policy, stepped up military exercises around Taiwan, incursions into Taiwan across the median line of the Taiwan Strait into what Taiwan considers its airspace, and other things like that. Also, diplomatic efforts, to flip diplomatic allies. There's been a number of those in the last year, and I think, other things will be considered now in Beijing. I think, my hope was that this election would provide an opportunity to try to reset the table and maybe, relaunch some kind of at least informal communication channels between the two sides of the strait, if not formal, government authorities to authorities communication channels. But I think with the interview that Tsai gave to BBC recently, that was quite stark, and then with the LY lineup and other things, it doesn't seem that that's going to be very easy to do.
Thank you. So, Vincent, I know you're just back from Taipei, but if we can stick just for this next question to imagining the view from Beijing, and in a way the question I asked Susan, what sort of soul searching might be going on there? Is that an overstatement? If you're in the Taiwan Affairs Office in Beijing, how animated is that conversation, I guess? Or are we overstating the impact? I mean, I just will say that the perceived wisdom for, folks like myself, I'm not a specialist by any stretch, is that Xi Jinping makes his major speech about a year ago.
Yes.
All this activity in Hong Kong goes the direction it goes. And again, this seems like not entirely for many of the reasons Susan gave, but to some extent a referendum on Beijing a little bit in Taiwan. What are they talking about saying on the mainland?
Right. Thank you. It's glad to be here. I just came back from Taiwan about 36 hours ago, so I'm like Susan. But
you're both suffering.
But thank you very much. So I obviously I came back from Taipei, not Beijing, so I don't know what they're talking about. But if I have to imagine, they can actually process the information the following way. One, that they say that perhaps Tsai's dramatic comeback is not that all surprising, because we actually seen a reversal of fortune between Tsai and Han beginning around May to July of 2019. I have just one slide. I know this is very small, you cannot see, but if you can follow the green curve, that's Tsai's popularity, and the blue curve is Han, KMT's popularity, and you see that their electoral fortune, at the very left is right after the 9-1 2018 local election. As Susan mentioned, it looked like Tsai was toast, but then KMT candidates' electoral fortune began to die very quickly, and in summer of 2019, a few things happened. Of course, the beginning with January 2019, Xi Jinping's speech, in my mind, actually moved the milepost. So he has changed the status quo. I know that current and former State Department officials like to talk about no change in the status quo. I think that he changed the status quo because up to that point, it was possible for the former ruling party or the government of Taiwan at that time, the KMT, to claim that the relationship between Taiwan and the mainland can be conducted on the basis of 1992. Mm-hmm. So for the KMT, the 1992 consensus meant that one China, but each side has its own interpretation. For Taiwan, it means Republic of China. And China at that time did not define that, but Xi Jinping actually began to define that. And he defined that as one China principle. And he equated one China principle with unification. And unification would proceed with the one country, two systems model, which was implemented in Hong Kong. And that he actually began to invite all walks of Taiwan to talk about the so-called Taiwan formula. So I interpret this as he began the unification agenda. This greatly alarmed the people in Taiwan and gave Tsai ing-wen in local parlance. He had picked up guns and picked up cannons. So sort of great ammunition. And also in Taiwan, there was a saying that this actually accentuated the people of a sense of crisis. That they're losing their country, 亡国感, which actually is pronounced almost the same as mangogan. So at one time, the dried mango was a very popular commodity in Taiwan. So that was began to change. And then, of course, in summer, the Hong Kong protests actually linked the future of Hong Kong and Taiwan because Tsai was very successful in linking sort of today's Hong Kong, tomorrow's Taiwan, and in contrast to the DPP's very quick and decisive nomination process, the incumbent seeking re-election after a brief intra-elite process, that Tsai was nominated by the DPP. The KMT actually went into a protracted period of intra-elite conflict. So a lot of power brokers wanted to be nominated. And this happened in the lead up to the summer and greatly damaged KMT's reputation. And then in July, Han Kuo-yu was nominated, but then that was just a very brief rebound, and then it's ever since declined ever since that. So the leaders in Zhongnanhai must say that, we know that this the election outcome is not that surprising. So Tsai is going to win, but then how do we interpret her electoral victory? Well, they can say that it's not as bad as we think, because in the legislative yuan, in the parliament, the DPP actually lost 7 seats compared to the last election. And the electoral system in Taiwan actually has 2 kinds of legislative seats. One is on district seats, much like the U.S. House of Representatives. And then the other is proportional representation, it's party list. On the party list, the KMT and the DPP won almost exactly the same percentage. So each party has received 13 seats. And of course, Tsai Ing-wen beat Han Kuo-yu by 18 percentage points, and Tsai's 8.17 million votes is the most of any Taiwan president. But her vote share is actually slightly less than Ma Ying-jeou's in 2008. So with all these mixed results, Beijing can say KMT still enjoys a substantial support in Taiwan. It's not all that bad, and that maybe they are used to the rotation in power in Taiwan democratic politics, and you can never quite rule out the KMT from coming back. I know that this, saying this is a stretch in imagination, but the KMT actually is going through a soul-searching process now, and just like when the DPP was trounced in 2008, a lot of people ruled them out, saying, the DPP is not going to come back in the wilderness, and look where they are today. So I would not rule out the KMT. But the KMT come back in what shape, in what form, it will be very different from today's KMT.
But back to your graph here, and it's really helpful. And again, even in the back of the room, I think you don't need the fine print, but it's worth noting that
all these events.
Well, I mean, your green and your blue graphs and the fortunes of the 2 candidates, they cross. I mean,
Yes.
They cross a couple of times, but they cross for good.
Yes.
Hong Kong, protesters occupy airport. Hong Kong, police fire live bullets, et cetera, et cetera. So, again, understanding all the other things, not a great candidate she was running against, Susan's incumbency point.
Yes.
But back to Zhongnanhai or wherever they're clearly aware of this. How does this not cause some upset and alarm in terms of the impact directly that Hong Kong has had on this?
So the Beijing can still claim victory, saying that, look, Tsai Ing-wen does not have as large a mandate as some might think, that she's not going to deliver Taiwan to independence. And had Han Kuo-yu won, he is not going to deliver Taiwan to a unification table. So the status quo can actually be very stable, because that only means that Xi Jinping's unilateral moving the milepost has received the pushback by the Taiwanese electorate. And I'm pretty sure that leaders in Beijing are now asking, among all the policies we have tried with respect to Taipei, why nothing has worked. And in my mind, the only thing that has worked in recent years was actually their economic enticement policy exhibited in the late Hu Jintao era and when KMT was in power. That was a period when the cross-strait relations were the closest. And of course, it generated a pushback as seen in the 2014 Sunflower Movement.
So before we leave the Hong Kong question, Susan, maybe come to you just for one more beat on it, which is things have been a little quieter in the last couple of weeks there, I think it's fair to say, but it's certainly nowhere near resolution. And this conversation makes me wonder, as that continues to, bubble or more than that as a point of tension, how might that impact public opinion in Taiwan? And the way she governs in her second term, or was it just an election issue, and now we're moving on?
Well, I think the Hong Kong situation is going to continue to bubble, but whether or not it has any major impact on the thinking, with respect to Taiwan and Beijing, or even on Tsai's part, the issue that Vincent raises of the Xi Jinping speech this was January 2019, sort of the anniversary of the 1979, et cetera. So, his speech, people in Beijing maintained, was not meant to say anything new, but was, in Beijing's mind, used in the election campaign and distorted in a way that favored and allowed Tsai to paint it that way. So I think what Beijing is probably doing, they're quite alarmed about the disunity in the KMT party. And that was a huge issue in this election. There was a third-party candidate. The KMT was completely split. There was a big controversy when we were there in November over the party list that the KMT put forward, and a huge fight within the party. There was a lot of just disarray on the part of the KMT. So I imagine that the story that they're telling themselves in Beijing is, it's a big problem with the sort of the message and the platform of the KMT and its inability to get its act together and identify a decent candidate. The kinds of things that Vincent talked about. What are they telling themselves about Tsai's mandate? What are they telling themselves about the split in the party share vote? I think, when we were in Beijing recently, they talked about the one country, two systems has been misnarrated in the media, that we never said that the system in Hong Kong is going to be the same one for Taiwan, et cetera, et cetera. So they're trying to, claw back a little bit of the ground that they've lost. But I think, they probably see that the Hong Kong issue was more an issue for the presidential election than it will be going forward for their Taiwan policy, I think. And so I don't expect that that in Beijing they're going to be taking into account as much what's going on in Hong Kong with respect to what they're going to be doing on cross-strait policy.
So let's go back to the place you have been recently,
yes,
Vincent, and maybe get comment from both of you as to how she does govern in this new term. Tsai Ing-wen said on Sunday there would be, quote, no provocation or rash behavior toward the mainland, but she also made clear no bowing to pressure from Beijing. And as you pointed out, there was a pretty, I think it's fair to say, tough in tone anyway, interview that she did on the BBC. So what's your prognosis in terms of the way she takes her mandate in this next term?
So I think interpreting the mandate is actually a very important issue for Tsai. On the one hand, she can say that her victory symbolized the majority opinions in Taiwan that they want respect. In fact, in her international press conference, she mentioned 4 things as the basis for dealing with mainland China. So equality, dialogue, democracy, and respect. So we know that it's more a declaration of her principle than an actual political basis that the two sides will resume political dialogue. But she feels that the public opinion is on her side, that those four principles sound very reasonable and give no indication that she will provoke Beijing. In her last 4 years, her policy has been described as preserving the status quo without endorsing the 1992 consensus. Mm-hmm. And for the most part, because of this basic policy framework, Taiwan has actually receded from being what I call the first mover in the triangular relationship. Compared to previous years, particularly the first DPP government, the Chen Shui-bian era, Taiwan was the first mover because it was not quite happy with its treatment in this relationship and felt that Taiwan was not receiving enough respect and proper treatment. So it was trying to change the status quo. So Beijing would respond. So Beijing became the second mover. And then Beijing would respond.
The United States is the third mover?
Exactly. Okay. But now, after 2016, things have changed. So on the one hand, in Beijing, we have a more assertive leader, Xi Jinping, who's really equate the recovery of Taiwan with part of his dream of national rejuvenation.
And he's a first mover kind of guy.
Correct. He's a first mover. And, one can argue that maybe the United States, was historically the third mover, had initially hinted the first move possibility. I mean that candidate Trump taking a congratulatory call from the president's side. So anyway, so the United States basically, I think, is quite satisfied with Tsai's performance so far, and believes that she will not be the first mover. And now the attention is actually to push back against Chinese assertiveness. So I think I don't expect Tsai to do very much with respect to initiative on cross-strait relations in the next 4 years, because and it really depends on whether Beijing will decide to double up or double down. Mm-hmm. So whether to increase more military diplomatic pressure against Taiwan, and that will in turn require the United States selectively to shore up Taiwan more, or Beijing will actually come back and say, all right, we made a mistake. Of course, they would never publicly say that, but then they will try a more effective and more conciliatory policy toward Taiwan. I think that the ball is actually in Beijing's court.
Okay. I want to come to your questions. Just one more from me, and it's for Susan about that other, I'm not sure where you rank now in terms of movers, Washington, D.C. But Susan made an interesting point, and a stark one, before this meeting that I think bears a few minutes here, which is, and I'm quoting you, Taiwan remains the most dangerous potential flashpoint in the U.S.-China relationship, has the potential to destabilize the entire Pacific region. So that's a stark point, but in terms of what we're talking about today and potential rocky road ahead, what should we be watching for from Washington, and what do you think we may see down the road?
Yeah, I think it's the right question. It's a very important question. I think that what Vincent mentioned about the status quo, where we are right now is that we are in a battle for the narrative over who's changing the status quo. The U.S. Wants to keep the status quo. No separation, no unification. I think most people think that the majority consensus view on Taiwan is for keeping the status quo, no separation, no unification. And obviously in Beijing, they're not happy with that in perpetuity, but they've been able to maintain it, recently, thinking that time is on their side. So the question really now is in the battle for the narrative over who's changing the status quo, and that's why you see political actors on all sides trying to move that. Beijing believes that U.S. is changing the status quo, that we are no longer wedded to our one China policy, and the U.S. has its own one China policy that maintains that the status is basically to be determined by people on both sides of the strait in a peaceful manner. And, there's a whole set of, understandings and norms that go since the Shanghai Communique and the other two communiques and the Taiwan Relations Act. There's a whole set of understandings that have come along with that. And Beijing would say that Washington seems to be moving away from that and changing the status quo. So that's there. And they also, of course, say that Tsai has changed the status quo by dropping the 92 consensus. So Tsai is saying that Beijing is changing the status quo. Washington is also saying that. So this is going to be where the dance comes. And, there'll be moves that'll be quite subtle, I think, probably on all sides. But they will be within that framework of trying to be able to defend the fact that we're not the ones, whichever side it is, changing the status quo. And that's going to be, it's kind of where we've been for the last, I would say, couple of years, and probably where we'll continue to be. And we have to hope that, people remain wedded enough to that narrative about not being the ones to break the status quo that we can keep the triangle stable. And I think that's where we should be hoping we go.
Yeah. And of course, there is another election you may have heard about happening later this year on our side of the pond. Does that, you don't hear much about the question we're discussing this morning in any of the debates and that sort of thing, but to what extent do you think, is there any daylight between what we may see from, let's say, a Democratic president or another Trump administration?
No one is in an election year in a U.S. Political race going to want to put any distance between themselves and the notion that they strongly support Taiwan.
Right.
So I don't think you'll see much of a difference among the various candidates on this particular issue. I think that the real bigger question is probably within this current administration, sort of the volatility level, because it's an election year. Does that go up? Or on an issue like Taiwan, that's one that is potentially sensitive and can create a crisis, is President Trump interested in keeping that to a minimum? And I think that depends a little bit on how things go. But up to now, I would say that he seems to be not inclined to inject tension into this aspect of U.S.-China relations. But that could change, I suppose.
We have enough volatility in other areas. Okay. Let's go to the room. We have some questions from beyond the room, but we always like to bias those of you who have made the effort to come here. Any questions for either Susan Thornton or Vincent Wang?
You can start.
Yes, you may. Just if you can tell us who you are. Okay.
It's very good to see you, Susan. My name is Jason Shi. I am a legislator and member of LY from Taiwan, and I'm a large member for KMT. So
thank you for being with us.
Yeah, and so all the things that you describe, I can attest to it. They are all true. So, yeah.
Thank you.
And it's very, very nice to be here, especially after a very important election, and also with a quite far-reaching significance and messages to the contemporary Taiwan, and as well as the election process and election outcome that would probably continue to affect and impact generations to come. And I'd just like to comment and also add my own perspectives on some of the things shared by our panelists. First of all, the LY seats composition is quite surprising than what we had anticipated from our own party's estimation. We were thinking KMT could get between 50 to 55 seats, and obviously we only have 38 seats. And originally we were guessing there could be a no majority in LY, but with a new Taiwan People's Party formed by the mayor of Taipei, who got 5 seats with their large votes. And this is largely result to what we call a split voting behavior for these elections in particular. Tsai Ing-wen, president, garnered over 8 million votes, whereas Han Kuo-yu get 5.5 million. And Song Chu-yu get less than 1 million. However, if you look at the way party votes are demonstrated, you see a lot of people vote for Tsai Ing-wen, but don't vote for DPP. And the at-large seats by DPP and KMT are both 13. So it means that the general public still has quite a discontent or sentiment towards the ruling party, but they vote in disfavor of Han Kuo-yu because of his personal style and also, I would say, his pro-China inclination.
Can I just ask, do you have a question? I just want to make sure folks have a chance. I don't mean to interrupt.
And I'll quickly jump to that. And I guess what I concern as a member of LY and also looking at where the country is headed to in the next 4 years is, you mentioned that Xi Jinping will be more aggressive, maybe diplomatically, in terms of economic strategy as well and trade. What would be Tsai Ing-wen's exit in terms of this? Would you see a more intensified cross-strait relations? Could there be a potentially flashpoint coming 2022, which is Xi's second 5-year term? He will need to defend his next 5-year term, although he's already technically eternal leader, but he will still find legitimacy to go to his next term. So that would be my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
For you, how will Tsai take the exit?
The exit.
I don't. Okay, I'll try it. I'll try it. I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't know for sure, but it strikes me that one of the things that Tsai and Beijing are both now focused on is what's going to happen in the 2024 election, because I think that is a pivotal one for thinking about how the Taiwan electorate is looking at the future of Taiwan. And so, there are 2 ways to go. One is the sort of legacy way. I want to, only Nixon could go to China. Only Tsai Ing-wen could sit down and try to broker some kind of a discussion, dialogue, whatever. She talks about dialogue. She talks about communication. So I think that's one possibility. I was hoping that would be a higher possibility, but now I don't think it's a very high possibility just because of the post-election kind of rhetoric on both sides and the sort of obvious kind of soul-searching going on now in Beijing over what happened and them not having a lot of room to occupy the space that's going toward more conciliatory types of moves. So I think the other way is Tsai Ing-wen looks to see how she's going to make sure that there's a DPP candidate elected in 2024, and that's going to come up with a certain different set of approaches, which you in the LY will get to have a front seat at.
What about, go ahead.
So just a point about the relationship between presidency and the legislative elections. Since Taiwan changed its electoral system in 2008, we have not had a divided government in which the presidency goes to one party, the legislative majority goes to another party. It's always the party that wins the presidency also controls the LY majority. This might change in the future. So I think that there is some split voting. You're right, but so that's why the DPP's margin is a little less in the LY. Now, with respect to how the next 4 years will go, I think that a lot of people describe this election as an intergenerational change. The KMT's traditional base is actually eroding. Those so-called the 外省人 mainlanders who came from China in the 40s and their descendants and so on, they are kind of dying off. And if you look at the longitudinal study, a full 60% of the Taiwanese people identify themselves as simply Taiwanese, and another 30 or 35% say they are both Chinese and Taiwanese, and those who identify themselves as Chinese is down to single digits.
Wow.
So over time, it seems that the ideational basis for a greening, or I don't want to call it permanent greening, but greening of Taiwanese politics is actually very perpetual. So does that mean that time is actually on Taiwan's side if you are a proponent of sort of a Taiwan identity? And this is another reason I think the status quo can be very stable, because as long as Beijing can live with this situation, which is that Taiwan is neither separation nor unification, the status quo can be very stable.
The generational thing is interesting.
Yeah.
Back to Hong Kong again, it's a very similar dynamic, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions for our guests? Yes.
Hi, I'm Allison Chen. I'm an undergrad, and I was wondering about the youth vote and the generational change you were talking about. I saw that there were a lot of campaigns for youth to return home to vote. Did that really impact their turnout? And is that going to last? And I remember that the Sunflower Movement gave rise to some new political parties. What is the future of those parties, despite the greening of of Taiwan? Thanks.
That's a good one for you.
Sure. First of all, those who went back to vote are all youth, including me. So this is because the Taiwanese election law currently does not provide for absentee ballot. I think this is really a drawback. They should really fix that. So the only way you can vote is actually to return to your household registration site, which is, in my case, is actually in Kaohsiung. I'm actually a Southerner. So anyway, but to your point about the voter and the support for the DPP, scholars have pointed out that the first-timers, the 首投族, actually voted overwhelmingly for Tsai Ing-wen. And this is actually a crisis for the KMT too. So in other words, they rely on the sort of those who are older, over 50, 60, and so on, with some kind of a Chinese identity. But the ones that are younger, for them, Taiwan has always been their existence, right? So, that these people will actually become more and more in politics. And the Tsai Ing-wen's support among the so-called 首投族 is actually very high, and this voter turnout this time is 75%, is actually the highest of all three elections. I credit that, with sort of the young people's enthusiasm about an election in which they fear that there may not be another chance. But I also credit it to the excellent weather. Saturday was magnificent weather. I went to the precincts. They learned from the mistake from the 2018 election. There were a lot more polling places, and the wait was much shorter. All these facilitated a great voter turnout. So overall, it's a great exercise of democracy.
Wow. I had not heard the weather comment before.
Oh,
One quick comment. I think the weather comment is a good reminder to all of us that correlation does not necessarily equal causation.
Right,
and
but it's correlated, though.
Right. No, that was probably correlated, but and may have even been causation. But I just wanted to make the point that on the KMT and whether or not this election was about cross-strait relations. I mean, I just said that everyone's trying to keep the status quo. Actually, the cross-strait policy of the two major parties, and actually all the parties in Taiwan, except for maybe a couple of the smaller new parties, it's quite convergent. I mean, pretty much all the parties' position now on cross-strait is extremely similar, and all about keeping the status quo. So for the narrative outside Taiwan that wants to make all the elections in Taiwan about cross-strait policy, I mean, I think it's just worth looking at that and seeing, how that has a potential to evolve in the future.
It's a really good point. We have a few good questions from folks watching on the live stream, and here's one for you, Susan. President, and it's not an area we've covered, President Tsai has spoken of advancing the relationship with the U.S., and a trade deal of sorts has been mentioned. Does Ms. Thornton see a possibility of an FTA, free trade agreement, or something similar with Taiwan?
Yeah, this is something that basically we've been working on in the U.S. government for many, many, many years and talking about. And in principle, it is a wonderful idea. In practice, it gets to be a lot more difficult. And if you followed any of the trade negotiations of the Trump administration or any other administration, you know that these things are quite contentious and take a long time. And we're involved in many, many different trade negotiations right now. So I think that the prospect, there's a long history on trade issues with between the U.S. and Taiwan. There's some bad memories of various, sectoral and other minutiae that I won't get into, but I think this is an area that we could move toward should things sort of, the environment change, some of the practical realities change, et cetera. But there's no reason in practice why we shouldn't be able to get there. I just don't think it's in the immediate offing, to be honest.
Thank you. Any others from the room? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering, I mean, if things in Hong Kong get worse again and Beijing decides to bring in the PLA or something, the situation, they decide to take control, to me it seems like that potentially is the biggest risk for the status quo triangle. I would just be interested in your thoughts there.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. That would be preceded by a series of steps, obviously, and depending on what those were, I mean, all the parties would have to react to that. But I mean, for Taiwan, it's not clear with the election over exactly what the ramifications would be of that, other than sort of obviously publicly and loudly condemning whatever it was, and also probably having an effect on opinion longer term in Taiwan, the kind of eventual sort of political movements that we're talking about, because I'm not sure exactly what they wouldn't really be a role for Taiwan to react to that in an action way. It would mean that Beijing is preoccupied with a different big problem and not Taiwan. So that could mean that, maybe they have a little bit less attention is a positive side benefit. I'm not sure. Obviously, U.S.-China relations would take a nosedive at that point, and this might be a good opportunity for me to mention my view, which is that some people in Taiwan seem to think that the worse U.S.-China relations get, the better it is for Taiwan. That's not my view. I think that really strained U.S.-China relationship is not going to actually be good for Taiwan. So there's a certain sweet spot there, and seeing things go really off the rails between the U.S. and China, I don't think is going to be beneficial for Taiwan in the long run.
I personally think the chance for China to intervene militarily in Hong Kong is quite small, although the leaders in Beijing probably are not happy with the way Hong Kong is going. But the ramifications for them to take such a drastic move would be catastrophic, not only for the reputation of one country, two systems, but also the likelihood of peacefully unify with Taiwan. Basically, that would mean the demise of one country, two systems, and of course, all the diplomatic ramifications Susan just mentioned. So I think Beijing currently does not have a very good solution. It hopes to wait out this current protest, just much like the umbrella movement five years ago, and to see if. But I think that will only bottle up from Hong Kong people's frustration until the next thing. That this anti-extradition bill actually threatened the sense of crisis of every Hong Kong resident, because they, in theory, could be extradited to mainland if they run afoul with mainland's legal system. So it's always a possibility, but I don't think that a lot of people say that Xi is the most assertive of Chinese leaders in recent memory, but I don't think he's reckless.
Mm-hmm. Susan's part of your answer about U.S.-China relationships and their, what people in Taiwan may wish for is a nice segue to this another question from beyond the room, and it's for you, Vincent. From what you've seen in Taiwan, what is most desired of the U.S. government for Taiwan? The Taiwanese government appears more careful, but what about the people? What do they wish and say about the United States?
So,
a giant question.
Yes, yeah. I think that in the diplomatic world, whenever you hear that the U.S.-Taiwan relations is the best in 60 years, you always have to sort of, to deep a little bit deeper than that. I think that Susan mentioned the concept of a sweet spot. I would just use sort of, another analogy, American analogy called the Goldilocks analogy. Mm-hmm. So not too hot, not too cold, just about right. What happened in the last 4 years is that in the United States, there has been a very significant change in my mind that an increasing number of policymakers and scholars and think tank types are beginning to question whether 4 decades of engagement policy has really achieved the U.S. objectives. So they are less likely to accommodate Beijing's every move. And under this kind of and this is also accompanied by the Trump administration's various perceived pro-Taiwan legislation. So the U.S.-Taiwan relationship has actually undergone a very qualitative improvement in the last 4 years without breaking, of course, the official framework. And I think that these trends will continue, that if the next U.S. administration continues to take sort of a more hard-nosed look at China, the value of Taiwan in the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy will increase, and some concrete cooperation between the United States and Taiwan will increase. But this will not. All this will be done without bubbling the official framework.
Mm-hmm. Time for one or two more. Yes, and if you can just remind us who you are.
Ing-wen Lai, born and raised in Taiwan, even though the U.S. is home now. So you know where my heart is. I came here and thank you for a very, very informative discussion. Now I feel a little more updated about what's going on there. My question is probably wondering the so-called status quo being the ideal state going forward, maintaining. And in some ways, the world is changing very rapidly. I'm from the private sector, so probably I feel that the world is changing so rapidly. Do we really need to have a political solution to this? In a way, are there other complexity, other forces that makes the framework, the status framework, less and less relevant over time, which from private citizen standpoint of view, that might be something to strive for. Is that wishful thinking, or given the world becoming smaller and more complex, is there a possibility there?
Well, Susan, you are the diplomats talk about the status quo.
All right. And, I think what you mentioned is extremely relevant and very underconsidered. Mm-hmm. So I mentioned the 2024 election. People assume that things are going to look in 2024 the way they do today, kind of. And what we see actually is this kind of fractionalization of politics in Taiwan. And right now we have very sharp political divides. You see, I think, the status quo being more and more difficult to maintain, given the nuance and ambiguity that surrounds the catechism of all of the agreements, starting from the 1970s to today. there's a very small priesthood of people who really understand these things and call them by their so-called right names. Average people are not going to keep up with that. And, politicians who aren't steeped in foreign policy issues are not going to keep up with that. And it's getting harder and harder with Twitter and other things to maintain the lines. And, so the question really about sort of status and all of these things, I mean, very much of that depends on narratives, ideational narratives that Vincent talked about on Taiwan. I think a big part of the answer to your question is about how can Taiwan interact with the international community in a way that's meaningful. And we've worked very hard on that in the U.S. government, I think, by creating, various outlets for Taiwan to participate in the international community, including this global training framework that we set up that allows them to sort of be participatory and contribute all that Taiwan, has to contribute to building capacity in the Asia region and beyond. So I think that's part of the answer, but, you're relying on governments in different places to move at the same rate in the same time zone, and, that's also not probably realistic. So it would be great if people could get beyond the current frames and think of something even bigger and better, but we haven't been in that space so far.
So UC Berkeley sociologist Thomas Gold, who is also a Taiwan hand, once said that the status quo is never static. So yes, the world is changing, and the status quo may be not totally satisfactory to any of the three sides, Washington, Beijing, or Taipei. And I think that for Taiwan, the yearning for greater respect and the participation in global arena is a natural outgrowth of their democratic achievements. But then they also know that there are realistic constraints. And even though the United States has been the most important supporter in terms of security and international participation, the United States currently does not have all the the instruments in its diplomatic toolbox to help Taiwan achieve many of its yearnings. So, for example, when even though the United States has increase its vigilance of Chinese diplomatic activities in the Western Hemisphere and the Oceania, and in fact have actually warned several of Taiwan's former diplomatic allies not to switch. But when they did, the United States was unable to stop that. Whether China will resume poaching Taiwan's remaining diplomatic allies remains to be seen. But however, there's no doubt that the U.S.-Taiwan bilateral relationship has strengthened in the last 4 years. And if Taiwan continues its current policy of non-provocation, not changing the status quo, and the United States continue this sort of a more realistic and hard-nosed reevaluation of U.S.-China relationship, I think that there's actually room for further growth in U.S.-Taiwan relations.
Thank you, Vincent. We're going to wrap it there. I just want to make one quick point before we do. One of the things we did in the latter part of 2019 here at the Asia Society was reboot our podcast platform. And for those of you who are interested, I invite you to check it out. It's called Asia in Depth. You can find it through our website or on various platforms, including YouTube and now Spotify as well. And what it is just it's a weekly conversation, not unlike this one, although it's typically one-on-one. Just in this calendar year already, we've done a conversation about the situation in Myanmar, a rapidly stitched together one on the strikes that killed the commander Soleimani in Baghdad and the ramifications in Iran and beyond. And tonight, I believe, we dropped the latest episode, which is something very different about Asian representation on screen in Hollywood, quite relevant given the success of the film Parasite. and Farewell, although the Farewell didn't get any nominations. Anyway, I invite you to do that. Asia in Depth is what it's called. Mostly, though, I just want to thank Vincent Wang and Susan Thornton for a great conversation, and thank you all for coming out. Appreciate it.